and welcome to our webinar series, Animals, Climate and Health. About a year ago, Charlotte Blattner and I got talking about organizing a conference about animals, law and philosophy. Charlotte is a senior researcher and lecturer at the Institute for Public Law of the University of Bern in Switzerland. And I'm a philosopher and novelist and currently work as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Wageningen about animals in the Anthropocene. Charlotte and I very soon understood that climate change should be our focus or our lens, because the questions of animals and the changing climate are often addressed solo while they are actually interconnected. Then COVID-19 broke out, and we noticed that there were many new types of conversations going on in society, connecting the dots between animal agriculture or animal exploitation more broadly, the climate crisis, and also this pandemic. Because of COVID, we decided to develop an online webinar series, which has the advantage of making this a dialogue across time and space. A few months ago, Kathrin Herrmann, who had a similar idea for a webinar series, joined us, and her expertise brought out the connections with global animal and human health and medical research and testing. Kathrin is a veterinary expert in animal welfare science, ethics, and law, and works as assistant scientist at the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And here we are with our first session. I'm very grateful to Charlotte and Kathrin for organizing this with me. To the speakers who so generously agreed to share their time and expertise with us, and to you, viewers, for thinking with us and acting with us towards a better world for us and our fellow animals. Here's Kathrin.
Welcome to our webinar on animals, pandemics, and global health. It is great to see the enormous interest in our webinar series. For today's first session, we have a wonderful lineup of experts. I'm very grateful to have Michael Greger, MacDonald, Astra Taylor, and John Dutkiewicz with us. I'm very grateful for their time and expertise that they are sharing with us. Over 500 people signed up for today's session, so that's quite amazing. So there is very much interest in the topic. And we received from people around the world that wanted to know if we are going to record the webinar series because of the time differences or scheduling conflicts. And yes, we will record, or we are recording, and we will then upload all the sessions to our website, animalsclimatehealth.com, that Eva already posted in the chat. And then in regards to questions, you can post your questions in the Q&A box. Please don't use the chat, use the Q&A box as they come to mind. So you can just, when you have any questions, just write them down and we will address them later. And we will try to get through as many questions as possible. And we look forward to a fruitful discussion with you all. And now I would like to introduce our moderator of today's session, Dr. John Dutkiewicz. And he is a political economist focusing on animal agriculture. And until recently, he was actually also at Johns Hopkins University. He was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Science. And currently, Jan is a postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University and a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School in the Animal Law and Policy program. Jan, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be moderating this panel today. I won't speak much so we can actually get to our speakers. One thing I wanted to note is that I'm very grateful to Eva and Kat for organizing this, because I think that as we all in our own ways, wherever it is we are, deal with the repercussions of COVID-19, much of the discussion has turned to the politics of actually coping and moving forward with COVID itself. But as this has happened, a lot of the really important foundational conversations and questions about the causes of COVID-19 have sort of fallen by the wayside. And this is, this is very dangerous from the point of view of global politics and global public health, because COVID is not the only zoonotic disease. It just happens to be a world historical pandemic. However, the same things that caused COVID have caused previously and will continue to cause pandemics unless we can think of some solutions to actually prevent future pandemics from spreading, or at the very least, mitigate the risk of future pandemics spreading. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our panelists about this today. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Michael Greiner, MD, is a physician, a founding member and fellow of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, a New York Times bestselling author, and internationally recognized speaker on nutrition. He has videos on more than 2,000 health topics freely available at nutritionfacts.org. He has lectured at the Conference on World Affairs, testified before Congress, and was invited as an expert witness in the defense of Oprah Winfrey in the infamous meat defamation trial. He is a graduate of Cornell University School of Agriculture and Tufts University School of Medicine. His CV is endless. I'm sure you all know his work. Three of his recent books, How Not to Die Cookbook, and How Not to Diet, all became instant New York Times bestsellers. And his latest book, How to Survive a Pandemic, was released in May of 2020. All proceeds he receives from the sales of his books go to charity. So, Dr. Greiner, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. So excited to be here. I'm looking very much forward to learning this morning. Over the last few decades, hundreds of human pathogens have emerged at a rate unprecedented in human history. Say, wait a second, emerged from where? I did most of my postgraduate medical work with AIDS patients. And I remember thinking to myself, when I was growing up, there was no such thing as HIV/AIDS. From where do emerging diseases emerge? Mostly from animals, the original source of nearly all major human infectious diseases. Humanity's biblical dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven and every little living thing has unleashed a veritable Pandora's ark full of humankind's greatest killers. Tuberculosis has thought to have been acquired through the domestication of goats last century, killed 100 million people. What started out in goats went on to infect 1/3 of humanity. Measles is thought to have come from domesticated sheep and goats, a mutant of the rinderpest virus. Smallpox has been a result of camel domestication. We domesticated pigs and got whooping cough, domesticated chickens and got typhoid fever, and domesticated ducks and got influenza. Leprosy came from water buffalo, the cold virus from cattle or horses. How often did wild horses have the opportunity to sneeze into humanity's collective face until they were broken and bridled? Right? Until then, the common cold was presumably only common to them. But wait, animals were domesticated thousands of years ago. Why all these new diseases now over the last half century? Well, we're changing the way animals live on a global scale. The AIDS virus is blamed on the bushmeat trade in Africa, the butchering of chimpanzees. SARS and COVID-19 been traced back to the exotic wild animal trade, these live animal wet markets in Asia. Mad cow disease is because we turned natural herbivores like cows and sheep into carnivores and cannibals by feeding them slaughterhouse waste, blood, and manure. Over our last pandemic, swine flu in 2009 arose not from some backwater wet market in Asia, but was largely made in the USA on industrial pig operations in the United States. Now, thankfully, swine flu only ended up killing about 500,000 people, but the next time we might not be so lucky. COVID-19 may just be a dress rehearsal for an even greater threat waiting in the wings of a chicken. In 1997, a virus named H5N1 was discovered in chickens a flu virus that would forever change our understanding of how bad pandemics could get. Now, so far it's remained a disease of poultry, not people, but of the hundreds of rare individuals it has infected, more than a half died. A flu virus with a case fatality rate exceeding 50%. I mean, what if a virus like that were to mutate and to acquire easy human-to-human transmissibility? I mean, the last time a bird flu virus jumped species and triggered a pandemic, it caused the deadliest plague in history, the 1918 pandemic, which killed 50 million people. What if instead of a 2% death rate in the case of the 1918 virus, we had a pandemic infecting billions where death was closer to a flip of the coin? I mean, as devastating as COVID-19 has been, food is still being restocked in our grocery stores. I mean, the internet may be slow, but it's still up. The lights are still on, and clean, safe drinking water is still flowing from the tap. Doctors and nurses are still showing up to work. So far, about 200,000 Americans have died. That's less than 1 in 1,500. The pandemic of 1918, in which 2% of the cases succumbed, 1 in 150 Americans died. Imagine if it were 10 times as bad as 2%, with 1 in 15 dying, or 25 times as bad, killing 1 in 6 of us. But the good news is there's something we can do about it, just as eliminating the exotic animal trade in live animal markets may go a long way towards preventing the next coronavirus pandemic. Reforming the way we raise domestic animals for food may help forestall the next killer flu. We got off easy in the last pandemic. Swine flu only triggered a Category 1 pandemic in 2009, but it did show a new origin point for pandemic viruses: pork production. It was like epidemiological blowback from our globalization of these intensive confinement conditions. And the unprecedented emergence of H5N1 and 10 other new bird flu viruses infecting humans around the world has been blamed on industrial poultry production. When we overcrowd thousands of these animals in these cramped, filthy football field-sized sheds to lie beak to beak or snout to snout atop their own waste, it's just a breeding ground for a disease. It's the sheer numbers of animals, the overcrowding, the stress crippling their immune systems, the ammonia from the decomposing waste burning their lungs, lack of fresh air, lack of sunlight. Put all these factors together, and what you have is kind of a perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of these so-called super strains of influenza. That's why the United Nations has urged that governments, local authorities, and international agencies need to take a greatly increased role in combating the role of what they call factory farming, which combined with these live animal markets provide what they call quote-unquote ideal conditions for the flu virus to spread and mutate into a more dangerous form, unquote. The H5N1 virus started out like all bird flu viruses as harmless waterborne intestinal infections of waterfowl, but only gained airborne transmission and a ramping up of extreme virulence within massive intensive poultry production. Perhaps only a change as great as 10 million bird megafarms could account for the dramatic series of mutations sufficient to create such a predatory virus. According to the CDC, the leading candidate for the next pandemic after COVID-19 is a bird flu virus known as H7N9, which is 100 times deadlier than COVID-19. Instead of 1 in 250 cases dying, H7N9 has killed 40% of the people it's infected. An estimate was published recently on what an H7N9 pandemic might look like in the United States, and they conclude millions of Americans dead. Now, thankfully, H5N1, H7N9 have yet to acquire the capacity for easy human-to-human transmissibility, but given that both H5 and H7 viruses have displayed a propensity to infect humans, there's a heightened concern that they may involve the ability to transmit between people and thereby initiate a pandemic. They're still out there, still mutating. H7N9 is estimated to be 3 mutations away from effectively transmitting between people. Pandemics are always a matter of not if, but when. And a pandemic with more than just a few percent mortality could not just threaten financial markets, but civilization itself as we know it. How can we stop the emergence of pandemic viruses in the first place? Well, if there's one lesson that I draw from my work on preventing or reversing chronic disease, it's that whenever possible, we should try to treat the cause. Given that the emergence of these deadly flu viruses are linked to the intensification of the poultry production, there have been calls for de-intensification of animal production. For example, suggesting the annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, quote, replacing large industrial units with smaller farms, lower stocking densities, potentially resulting in less stress, less disease susceptibility, and less infectious contacts and smaller infectious loads, unquote. Maybe these animals are the ones that could use a little social distancing at this point. The American Public Health Association, the largest and oldest association of public health professionals in the world, has called for a moratorium on factory farming for nearly 2 decades now. I mean, maybe COVID-19 is the dry run we needed to kind of, the fire drill to waken us out of our complacency and reform the food system before it's too late. But if, as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations visualized it, the next pandemic starts with increased demand for poultry products and ends up with human-to-human transmission, maybe we need to move beyond just giving these animals more breathing room. An editorial in the Journal of the American Public Health Association went beyond just calling for de-intensification of the poultry industry, but actually questioned the prudence of raising so many animals in the first place. And in fact, I'm going to share that PDF, and instead of just reading the quote here, I'll go down here. So this is in the American Journal of Public Health, an article called Chickens Come Home to Roost. It is curious, therefore, given the pandemic threat, that changing the way humans treat animals, most basically ceasing to eat them, or at the very least, radically limiting the quantity of them that is eaten, is largely off the radar as a significant preventive measure. Such a change, however, if sufficiently adopted or imposed, could still reduce the chances of the much feared influenza epidemic. It would be even more likely to prevent unknown future diseases that, in the absence of this change, may result from farming animals intensively and killing them for food. Yet humanity does not consider this option. This, however, may be changing thanks to food innovations. I mean, have you looked at the dairy case lately at the supermarket? I mean, some of America's largest dairy producers have recently filed for bankruptcy because of this constellation of new consumer choices. And the same thing is now happening in the meat aisle. There's been this tremendous surge in interest in diversified protein sources, given the increasing consensus that reduced meat consumption is critical for addressing both the climate crisis and our burgeoning epidemics of lifestyle diseases. And it could also help protect us against the pandemic threats. We need to accelerate the movement towards plant-based milks, plant-based meats, plant-based egg products. No longer a kind of a niche market for vegetarians. Major meat producers have started reorienting themselves as really protein companies rather than meat companies, started blending in vegetable proteins to make hybrid meat products, like Purdue has what they call chicken plus nuggets, or Tyson's whole blends as these blended sausage lengths. In Smithfield, the world's largest pork producer, recently debuted an entire line of fully plant-based products. Hormel, the purveyors of Spam, an entirely new plant-based line too. Let me read you a headline from a few months ago. KFC to roll out Cargill's plant-based chicken across China. KFC to roll out Cargill's plant-based chicken across China. Talk about a cultural revolution. We're not talking about Tofurkey. Cargill is America's largest private corporation, one of the biggest meat packers in the world, right? But if you're like, you'll have to pry that pork chop out of my cold, dead hands, well, we may be able to have our meat and eat it too. An even more innovative approach to pandemic prevention was suggested by none other than Winston Churchill in 1932 in an article in Popular Mechanics entitled 50 Years Hence. He predicted that, quote, "We shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately in a suitable medium," unquote. And indeed, the prediction is becoming a reality. Instead of, taking a cutting from a plant and growing vegetables, right? You're taking a sample from an animal and growing meat, potentially lots of meat, theoretically 1 billion pounds from a single sample. Indeed, in terms of efficiency, growing meat straight from muscle cells could reduce greenhouse gas emissions and water use by as much as 96%, lower land use by as much as 99% in the life cycle analyses that have been published so far. But when you factor in pandemic risk, I mean, the benefits to human health of a slaughter-free harvest could arguably rival those to planetary health. Food safety has been considered the primary human health benefit of such an approach, this cultivated meat approach. It's been a 6-fold increase in food poisoning over the last few decades here in the States, sickening tens of millions of Americans every year, and contaminated meats and animal products are the most common cause. And so when the cultivated meat industry calls its product clean meat, that's not just a nod to clean energy. Right? Food poisoning pathogens like E. coli, Campylobacter, Salmonella are due to fecal residue, traces of which are found in most poultry sampled in the United States, about half of retail ground beef and pork chops, right? They're intestinal bugs, but you don't have to worry about them if you're producing meat without intestines. Right? You don't have to cook the crap out of the food if there's no crap to begin with. Just like you don't have to worry about brewing up new respiratory viruses if you are producing meat without the lungs. In this age of emerging diseases, there are now billions of feathered and curly-tailed test tubes for viruses to mutate and incubate within billions more spins at pandemic roulette. But along with human culpability comes hope. I mean, if changes in human behavior can cause new plagues, well, then changes in human behavior may prevent them in the future. We may be one bushmeat meal away from the next HIV, one pangolin plate away from the next killer coronavirus, and one factory farm away from the next deadly flu. You know, tragically, we don't tend to shore up the levees until after disaster strikes, and it may take a pandemic that wipes out millions before the world realizes the true cost of cheap chicken. Thank you so much. Looking very much forward to hear what our next speaker has to say, Mia McDonald.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greiner. That was a captivating and high energy talk as always. To answer the question in the QSA, yes, I do believe that Dr. Greiner is on some kind of walking desk treadmill because he is a multitasking dynamo. So moving on to our next speaker. Oh, I'd like to note that we will be collecting all the questions and we're going to be having a discussion and asking all the audience questions at the end of the session. So if you have any questions for Dr. Greiner or if you've asked questions for Dr. Greiner during his talk, we're going to try to bring those up at the end of the talks. And that way we can actually ask the questions of all the speakers to sort of collect their expertise and start a conversation between them ideally. So please keep those questions coming in. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mia McDonald, who is the Executive Director and founder of Brighter Green. She is a New York-based public policy analyst and writer who has worked as a consultant to a range of international NGOs, including the Ford Foundation, the World Wildlife Fund, the Greenbelt Movement, the Sierra Club, Save the Children, and several United Nations agencies, among others, on issues of environment, sustainable development, women's rights, and gender equity, reproductive health and population, as well as conservation and animal protection. She has published many articles in popular and environmental media, authored a number of policy papers and reports, and contributed to 4 books, including Nobel Peace Laureate Wangari Maathai's best-selling autobiography, Unbowed. She is a senior fellow at the World Watch Institute and has taught in the Human Rights Program at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and the Environmental Studies Department at NYU. She is a member of the board of directors of the Greenbelt Movement International North America and of the Culture and Animals Foundation, and has been a member of the boards of Farm Sanctuary and the Food Empowerment Project. She received a master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School at Harvard, a BA with honors from Columbia, and also studied English literature and language at Oxford University. So Mia, take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, or I shouldn't say good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I know we're all in different time zones. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jan, and thank you. I do want to say, just very briefly, full protocol, but thanks so much to Kathrin, Eva, Charlotte, for setting up this webinar series. I think it's so important and really powerful to talk across sectors and develop linkages and to really see how we can all work together more effectively in this very, very unsettling time, and yet with some potential for some real transformative change. I really also appreciate my fellow panelists, Dr. Greiner and his energy here at Astra and her really quite extraordinary work. So I will speak relatively briefly, I hope, about the need for a new relationship with the non-human world. I think that COVID really, really has illuminated, underscored that in many, many ways. And that relationship would be one based on mutuality as opposed to exploitation. I will say a bit more about that as I present, and I will use industrial animal agriculture as a case example as I do that. Very quick word on Brighter Green's work. So we are based here in New York, and we have sought to bring animals to the policy space, both in global policy and national policy, and some local as well, as subjects of policy making, that they should be that and not solely objects. We've also really sought to link issues around animals, environment, global sustainability with a real focus on equity and rights. And in that context, we've also done a lot of work charting the growth, consequences, and also alternatives to the global spread of industrial animal agriculture or factory farming, as Michael has discussed. And we've approached that from the climate entry point, from food security, from animal welfare and rights, from biodiversity, from livelihoods, and a little bit from public health as well. So what I wanted to start by saying is, for many of us, we're into the 6th month of this COVID crisis that has disrupted our lives, our thoughts, our daily activities. I'm in New York, where yesterday our skies were hazy because some of the fires from the west coast of the United States, some of the smoke was here. So we see those fires, we see destructive hurricanes in the southeast of the United States. We've seen in past weeks intensive flooding in Dakar, Senegal, in Wuhan, China, which is where likely the coronavirus emerged. We see a climate crisis that's getting harder and harder to deny, right? And I think most of us on this webinar, we're not in the business of denying it. So we see a climate crisis, and we've also had evidence in recent reports from Living Planet, World Wildlife Fund, from the Convention on Biological Diversity, that we are in the midst of an enormous biodiversity crisis as well. So none of the targets that were set to be met by the world's governments by this year, 2020, for biodiversity protection and even restoration will be met. There's progress towards some of them, but basically none of those key targets will be met. So that is another crisis. And as Dr. Greiner has explained, obviously we have the challenge of zoonoses emerging from wild animal populations. We also have massive exploitation of wild animals as well, which is an enormous concern to most of us, I'm sure, even if our focus might be on domesticated animals and food systems. What I will say is, despite what Jan said, and I agree with, that some of the origins of this crisis are being lost in the rush to move forward, go back to normal, get things moving again, is that there really is an emerging consensus, especially among a number of global agencies, researchers, like many of you on this webinar, that the food system needs to change dramatically, that animal agriculture needs to be interrogated more carefully, that we need to be moving to much more plant-based, plant-forward food systems, and that this food system that has been sold to those of us in the industrialized world and increasingly to those of us in the global south as modern, as progressive, has huge flaws. huge negative consequences, is extremely costly, and doesn't feed people well. You know, we have enormous food insecurity in the United States. Before COVID, we have accelerated food insecurity in the United States now. We have almost 150 million people who will be facing extreme hunger, partly as a result of COVID, which has obviously shut down economies, scrambled livelihoods. So we have a food system that's not serving us, that's wildly destructive of biodiversity, that's also fueling the climate crisis. 23% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change. Majority of that is from destruction of forests, conversion of land to grazing for ruminant animals, and also to the feed crops. And given that we raise and slaughter about 80 billion animals a year, these are just domesticated animals, there's enormous demand for feed crops, and that is leading to more incursions into the natural world. What I also think COVID showed those of us in the US, but also globally, is how powerful the meat industry is, and also how lacking in accountability it has been. And I think Astra is going to talk a bit more about this, the political economy around this sector that still has enormous political power, policy power, even though it's failing on so many levels. And one example in a way that Brighter Green also worked over the summer was to seek to draw attention to the extreme infection rate among meat processing workers in the United States. And there were examples of this in other countries as well, including Brazil, other parts of Latin America and Europe too. And that the meat processes, and these are enormous companies, JBS, Cargill, Tyson, had done very little to nothing to protect them. Even basic protections like social distancing, like masks and PPE. And in many ways, we're treating the workers, largely Black and brown, often recent immigrants, as expendable as the animals are. So as we speak, there have been more than 40,000 COVID infections among meat processing workers in the United States. There have been more than 200 deaths. And even despite more media attention, more activism, some of these challenges are continuing. The infection rate has not been reversed. Some of them are still reporting lack of social distancing, lack of line speeds being slowed down, and even, it almost sounds like an evil genius thought of this, under the cover of COVID, some of those same companies getting waivers from the US administration to speed up line speed so they can slaughter pigs and chickens more quickly. And that puts workers at greater risk, and obviously huge risks for even additional animal cruelty. I mean, how on earth can people slaughter 1,000 pigs in a minute or 1,000 chickens in a minute? So that has, I do think, illuminated for many both the power and the real dark side of this sector of animal agriculture in ways that really hadn't been as clear before. Many of us on the webinar will have known that. We've been working on these for many years, but that kind of illumination. And obviously COVID has also illuminated vast crises around inequality, vast crises around justice, vast challenges and real gaps in how we interact with the non-human world, with non-human animals, and each other. Another aspect of this COVID crisis in US meat processing, so there's been very good reporting now from ProPublica that the meat industry had some warnings, had some preparation in past US administrations. A pandemic is coming again, as Dr. Greiner said, they're coming. Had chosen to do very, very little preparation for that. And another facet of this situation in the US of COVID and meat processing is millions, tens of millions of animals have been, and I use air quotes, depopulated because they couldn't be slaughtered in time. And as some of us will know, these animals have been basically bred, altered, mutilated to basically fit a machine. And when they couldn't be slaughtered because there were some disruptions in labor force because of COVID, many tens of thousands, tens of millions, excuse me, we don't even know how many, were depopulated as a euphemism. Some were smothered, some were, heat systems were turned off inside their factory farms. So I think that's also been extremely shocking for people, and the link of exploitation of non-human animals and human workers, I do think has given some opportunity to work on these issues across different sectors. And we joined collective action to call for protective equipment for meat processing workers, to call for slower line speeds, to call for much more regulation of this horror of depopulation. And we worked on that with environmental groups, animal protection groups, food justice groups, labor groups, actually frontline workers in the meat processing sector. So while I think the meat industry and feed as well has enormous ongoing power, and we also know the US administration basically said, this is an essential service, meat processing workers have to go back to work. I think there are real opportunities to build powerful coalitions to challenge the sector's power, to challenge the model. In terms of the environmental effects of large-scale animal agriculture, it's also an enormous user of potable water around the world, and that is becoming more scarce, also as a result of climate change. Its operations are often in low-income communities of color who experience higher levels of air pollution, water pollution, and it has just real weaknesses that were also seen in COVID. This, on-demand supply chains are very long. Everything has to be very mechanized, the animals themselves, and the industry couldn't cope with that without COVID infections among workers, and then this massive culling of animals. So I think that that's also important to note. And one other addition to what Dr. Greiner said about the emergence of zoonoses, even in China, where we have a very strong program, about a year ago, something called African swine fever became embedded in China. And, data is not perfect, but suggests perhaps 100 million pigs were either culled or succumbed to that disease. So again, the scale of this is really, really enormous. So I just want to move now to, okay, what do we do and where can we go? One other point I do want to make is that there is more space to discuss these issues. Brighter Green has been very involved in the UN Climate Change Convention for a number of years. And I will say many years ago, despite the science, right, we had Livestock's Long Shadow from 2006, a report from the Food and Agriculture Organization on the livestock sector, not just about climate, but how it disrupts and affects ecosystems and a whole range of environmental factors. When we used to, very small number of groups, talk about this in climate conferences, it was almost as if we were speaking Russian. And unfortunately, I don't speak Russian. But the response was, oh, you want me to be a vegetarian? You want me to be a vegan? No real grappling with the science and with this as an issue of public policy. I do think that that has changed. There is a biodiversity summit coming up at the end of September at the United Nations, which is a lead up to the large biodiversity convention that's been postponed till next year, which will take place in China. And what I see in the lead up to that is many more statements. The UN Environment Program, there's a global leaders letter being circulated that really does seek to grapple, not from an animal rights perspective, but really does seek to grapple with the roots of COVID and how economies, social systems, thinking about the non-human world should change. So I find that encouraging. Now, again, we all have to be careful in terms of not taking statements as reality or as an implementation plan. But I am interested in seeing UNEP really change, much more discussion of food systems, much more discussion of meat itself and feed, the global outlook and others. So I think that it's harder to deny the reality. We know that there are still leaders and others who want to deny reality, but it's much, much harder to deny that. And I would thank probably many of you on this call for the research that you have done. Okay, and now I just want to move to, so what could this new relationship with the non-human world look like? And I will speak more based on the food system, but obviously there are many more ways where this new approach, new values, new commitment to action could be applied. And I do really look forward to the discussion so we can discuss, so we can get into more of these issues. So if we think about this future in the food system, I'll just say a few points. One would be to end the bailout subsidies and incentives that enable the mass production of commodity feedstock and animals. We know, again, that is widespread, not just in the US, not just in China, not just in Brazil. A second step would be to reorient agriculture to smaller scale, bioregional production of low carbon intensive fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, and grains. That would also include urban farming, much more focus on how can urban environments be producing food, and also shorter links with farmers in rural areas. Third would mandate decent opportunities for co-ownership and livable wages for all workers in the food chain that foster dignity and literal and social investment. There's a huge gap around that, absolutely. A fourth would prioritize minority-led and women-led and indigenous initiatives as central to a reimagined farm-to-table economy that's accessible to all, restores a measure of equity and justice to those forced from their lands over several centuries. And a fifth step would be to restore public lands and even private lands now given over to grazing cattle and other ruminants, as well as producing feed crops, to rewilding, conservation, community management, and even opportunities for reforestation, watershed protection, and increased biodiversity. By shifting from extraction to restoration, monocultures to polycultures, commodification to bioregionalism, concentrated power to participatory democracy, hyper-individualized and divisive social structures to a social and political ecosystem that honors community, diversity, and the public good, we stand more chance of collective survival. And then just very briefly, where I think we can work together more towards that vision and visions that many of you will have is linking, I think, academic research to policy processes. I see more of that, but I think that's been a bottleneck in the past. I think there's a younger generation of academics very interested in cross-sectoral linkages, intersectionality. I think stronger cross-issue, cross-regional coalitions, and this webinar series is a part of creating that. I think more voices and people really advocating for real change as a result of COVID and becoming constituents more directly for the non-human world. And I think through the UN system and national policies, even though that can seem a bit like a utopia, I do think that there are opportunities for that. Certainly interrogating the political economy of the meat and feed sectors, even in big producing countries like Brazil, where we see the really horrifying fires in the Amazon and Pantanal. All of agriculture is 5% of Brazil's GDP. All of agriculture is 5.5% of the US's GDP. And even though I know there are concerns, and I agree with them about measuring GDP and what does it really show about the well-being of a society and the justice of a society, still, if we think of all the destruction of the environment, of non-human lives for 5% of GDP, I think that some of those data points need to be better known. I also think documentation of what is happening, what could change, narrative arcs, and some of us are working on those, and just confronting power in various ways. And as Jan said, to remind people, policymakers, media, the private sector, how this began, what the consequences of large-scale animal agriculture have been, and really demanding change. So I will stop there and then look forward to the discussion. One other, very, very quickly, we've been working to think of what could a manifesto, a kind of post-COVID manifesto that would span nature, domesticated and wild animals would look like. And we've been doing some work with a few different groups, but I would really welcome people's thoughts on that, on this call or perhaps after this as well, your inputs of what that could look like and where that could be used. So thank you so much, and back to you, Jan.
Thank you so much, Mia, for your talk. A lot of food for thought there and a lot of questions pouring in. So you're not off the hook yet. There are a lot of questions coming your way. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce the last of our panelists, an absolute treasure in American public and intellectual life. Astra Taylor is a documentary filmmaker, a writer, and a political organizer. She is the director most recently of What is Democracy? And the author of the fantastic book, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. Her previous work includes The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age, winner of the 2015 American Book Award. She is also the co-founder of The Debt Collective, and I am honored to say a co-author of mine in the past. So Astra, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you for that very kind introduction, and I will be building on the things that we've written together and thought together, Jan. And I just want to say thank you to Mia and Michael. You know, and I feel as though I'm a bit of a tourist in this space with deeply held convictions. So I'll try to add, I hope, in a fruitful way. This is not my main area, but something I believe is incredibly urgent. So who am I? I'm a writer, filmmaker, and an organizer. And my very first memory, I have to say, is being 4 years old and deciding to become vegetarian, having this epiphany that we shouldn't dominate and eat animals. I became one of these children, you know, these kids, these proselytizers. I had a magazine. I tried to tell my peers, you know, I was like 10, 11. The grownups are telling us this is okay. It's not. And I have to thank Dr. Greger because he accomplished actually what I couldn't quite do, which was convert my father to veganism. So, you know, I tried for 25 years, vegetarian, couldn't get him to go take the next step. So thank you for that. And he's a scientist, a medicinal chemist, now very much concerned with zoonotic diseases. He actually gave a talk called How Eating Animals Has Come Back to Bite Us, which it certainly has. These are important issues to me, but what I have done in my adult work is to focus on issues of political economy, economic justice. So as Jan said, I am part of something called the Debt Collective. We try to aggregate debtor power in order to fight for economic inequality, fight for economic equality, to open new paths in the battle against concentrated wealth and power. And concentrated wealth and power is at play here too. Our desire for meat is not purely spontaneous. So, you know, there's different, I guess I see this as sort of, there's the ethical arguments for a plant-based diet, which are very near and dear to me. But there are all these other worlds that I think should be convinced that this is important. And I think anyone interested in economic justice needs to take questions of the treatment of animals in the non-human world very, very seriously. And this is, I think, gets to what Mia was saying about a powerful coalition. I mean, there's all of these points of powerful overlap with all of these other vibrant causes right now. We're in a moment of enormous concentration of wealth. We're seeing, you know, huge bailouts for corporations in this moment of crisis when people are facing food insecurity. 40 million people are about to be made homeless. It seems, you know, we're having these fires, this enormous crisis. You know, I think people concerned with economic justice should see that the concentrated economic power in the animal agriculture industry very troubling. There's implications, of course, for the climate movement. We all know that. There's racial justice considerations. Most of the people who work in the meatpacking industry are Black and brown recent immigrants. As Mia said, the people to whom the profits go, overwhelmingly white men. Environmental racism is a problem. My sister, Sonora Taylor, has written about the natural, what she sees as the sort of fruitful overlaps and forms of solidarity that could emerge between disabled people and concern for the treatment of animals. You know, many of the animals in factory farms are bred to be essentially disabled, and it has, you know, and many of the workers are maimed. They have repetitive stress injuries. There's overlap there. So all of these coalitions, I think, could be made more robust, brought into being. But we have to do the work. We have to do the work of organizing and building power to get there. So in this piece I co-wrote with Jan, it was for The Guardian, and along with our friend Troy Vettis. One line we said was that, you know, eating meat remains a socially acceptable form of science denial. And we meant that because, you know, even progressives, even people who believe, we now talk about it as though it's a matter of faith, believe the science, believe in climate change, you know, are still very attached to eating meat. And I think, you know, as a longtime vegan, I've often tried to be nice, to not be the annoying vegan. And I think this is a moment, the COVID moment is emboldening me, and I hope others, to push a bit further, a bit harder. And to say, look, if we want to mount an adequate response to this disaster and prevent future ones, then we need to start taking animals into consideration, because these disasters are preventable. I think it's really important to be clear that COVID-19 is not a natural disaster. It's a social and political one, right? Because it comes out of the patterns of land use and these interactions between the human and non-human world that allow these zoonotic diseases to jump species. So, in my view, there are compelling ethical, epidemiological, ecological, and economic reasons to take all of these issues really seriously. One thing I learned from our other co-author, Troy, was that, just how it's funny, we're in a moment where everything can seem so novel, unprecedented. This isn't new. Edward Jenner, who invented the first vaccine for smallpox, said that, these things aren't inevitable, they arise from our sort of encroachment on nature. And so I just want to read a quote. "The deviation of man from the state in which he was originally placed by nature seems to have proved to him a prolific source of diseases. He has familiarized himself with a great number of animals which may not originally have been intended for his associates." And this is 1798. So it's been a while. What is driving us to have this contact with animals? And this is where I think we need that economic perspective. I know many people agree. I'm not saying anything very new, but it's greed, not need. Exploitation, the exploitation of the non-human world is driven by market imperatives. And so the hunger for flesh and the hunger for profits are intertwined in a system that is destructive for all of us, for all life on this planet. And, it's a massive, we're talking about, on the one hand, it's a massive industry. I think keeping that GDP point in perspective is really important. Are we going to create this much destruction when you take into account the externalized costs? Like, is it really worth it? But nevertheless, in the US, it seems like the meat is a $900 billion industry, $2 trillion globally and growing. And, why is it growing? Because there's a tremendous vested interest pushing this idea that a diet that has meat, red meat in particular, is healthy and desirable and symbolic of an affluent, good life. This is a kind of propaganda that has its roots in the US. So I think if we want to think globally, I do think starting in the United States is really important. This is the place that this ethos of red meat really arises. And this greed, compels producers of meat to behave in a certain way. Industrialized farming is driven by these market incentives, right? So mega farms cram all of these animals into these spaces, hundreds of thousands of them at a time. It creates the push to create genetically similar animals, animals that are essentially machines in order for profits to be higher. And this torments the farmers as well. I mean, there was the people on the assembly line who I already mentioned, but, farmers, chicken farmers, for example, where we very well might see the next terrible avian flu, are, experience, basically they're controlled almost like, drivers for Uber by Tyson, by these few big chicken mega firms. And, what I recently read was that when they're sent the sort of price lists and instructions for how to farm, they're also sent sort of suicide prevention material because their lives are also so terrible. And they are so under the thumb of these big corporations. And these companies, are driving them also to cram the animals into these conditions. And thus there is the drive to feed, to put antibiotics in the feed. That is also going to be that is already a huge public health threat. We could see the emergence, the next pandemic might be an antibiotic resistant superbug. And the authorities I've seen, outline what that might look like. It paint a pretty terrifying picture, right? So that's another threat on the horizon that we know of. We know it's there, and yet the behavior hasn't been changed. So when you're a servant of the market, you treat animals, you treat human beings like machines, and you try to control them just to get that little extra boost of productivity. You know, and for me, I work on issues of indebtedness, right? It's one way in which these farmers are controlled is they're deeply indebted to these mega producers, and they can't get out. They can't get out of these financial contracts where they're set up basically to lose. These forces are also driving behavior in other countries, not just with American farmers. But for example, Dr. Greiner mentioned the fact that HIV likely jumped species because people were hunting for bushmeat. Well, it seems as though part of why people were going further into the forest and engaging in this kind of quest for wild game is because they had been fishermen and they were pushed out of the waters by industrial trawlers, right? The Chinese government has encouraged smallholders to breed and procure wild game to compensate for the fact that they can no longer compete with the large livestock firms. So these dynamics play out internationally in all sorts of ways that endanger all of us. All over the world, poor people are forced into desperate circumstances by market forces and state policy, and this accelerates the destabilization of the local ecology. So I think, you know, in this sense, by taking the structural view, we kind of step away and blame individuals less and look at what are the structural conditions that are driving this kind of behavior and this kind of destruction. And the destruction is really serious. I mean, we are interfacing, is one way of saying it, with the natural world in ways that put us all at risk. We're reducing biodiversity. Biodiversity is a buffer that dampens the spread and the emergence and the spread of zoonotic diseases. And we're also, you know, giving over the natural world to this one industry. Between farming, ranching, and feed crops, the livestock industry gobbles up 40% of the world's habitable surface. I mean, is this what we want to use the earth for? It seems very sad to me. So I think, you know, what this does is it allows this industry to amass an enormous amount of power, and you can't separate that industry's might from sort of the larger changes in the economy through the 20th century to today, right? So Donald Trump, Mia mentioned this, basically, you know, said meat was essential and used the Defense Production Act to force meat packing plants to stay open, despite the fact that this was essentially a death sentence for vulnerable workers, many of them refugees, immigrants, definitely underpaid and abused already. And of course, you know, meat isn't essential. We can live without it. And the workers knew that. The workers actually asked people to boycott. In Iowa, workers said, please, you know, boycott meat. We're being forced to work in these dangerous conditions. And one can imagine, you know, a different set of policy responses, right? I mean, there could be, you can imagine a world where the US government said, okay, actually, you know, let's have some ambition and start encouraging people to eat a more plant-based diet, to farm, you know, just like the victory gardens of World War II, to farm and to eat more plants and to be more self-sufficient, you know, and that's not the world we live in. Instead, Tyson and Smithfield and these, you know, other companies got to sort of, you know, make some phone calls and say, no, you know, keep us open no matter what, even if people die, not to mention those millions and millions of animals that were depopulated. And that tracks with the concentration of corporate power that we're seeing in other sectors, right? In fact, the term chickenization is used by people who work on issues of monopolies and antitrust, because that concentration of there's a few companies, and they essentially basically say, you know, we're not going to compete with each other to control the market. You know, we see that in all sorts of areas of American business. And so the fact that, you know, corporate power in general is becoming more robust is, you know, part of the reason I think that we are now having a even more challenging, the struggle is even more immense if we want to get the kind of policy changes that are important to start to address future pandemics and address climate change, right? And so this is why I think people who care about animal ethics also need to just put the general fight for equality, economic equality, at the center of their politics, right? Because I don't think we're going to get one without the other. And, you know, and it's all connected. We see this in the reaction to the proposal for a Green New Deal, right? We see that, you know, the Republicans latched on immediately to this idea that they're going to come for your hamburgers, and laughing at the left for talking about livestock and methane, the whole farting cows meme. I mean, all of these battles are interconnected, right? Green New Deal, as it is outlined, is part of a larger social transformation that would also bring in public goods that would lift up the working classes, and yes, maybe take some people's hamburgers away, though maybe that's not what we want to lead with. So Mia gave some of my prescriptions. I don't want to reiterate too much, but I do think that we can't look at these questions in isolation. They're all bound up. Discussions about meat do tend to kind of, or meat and animals, they do kind of tend to fragment in a way that I think is, hurts the cause, right? So some people are concerned for workers, some for consumers, some people talk about animals. All of these things are interconnected. I think, on an individual level, the simplest thing we can do is abstain from eating animals. And that's one thing I want to challenge my, friends who are progressive, who are leftists, who are invested in the fight for economic justice. I think they have to care about animal issues too, and recognize that this is not something, this is not something that they can ignore if they actually want to create a more egalitarian and sustainable world. But I think we also have to think about the policy level. I don't think our personal changes will get us where we need to be. So Mia made a point that I really want to echo. We need a major intervention in terms of ending the subsidies to industrial animal agriculture. We need to tax animal products to incorporate those externalized environmental public health consequences, right? Dr. Greger mentioned cheap chicken. There's a reason it's cheap, because we're not paying the full price. We're actually subsidizing this production. We absolutely do need to support other forms of sustainable local farming practices. We need to figure out what the world is we want to build and subsidize that instead, and facilitate that transition. And then I think public investment, this is something Jan brings up and is really much more involved in, but public investment in meat alternatives, both plant-based and cellular agriculture. I am worried about, actually, this is a point maybe that we could discuss more. I'm worried about the control of that domain by the megacorps. I mean, given the way Tyson treats its chickens and its chicken farmers, I'm not sure the vegan world I want to see is one where we're all eating cellular proteins that are controlled at the level of the patent by these companies, right? So I think it's really important to make sure that new technology is open source, and that we pay attention to these structures of economic control, who is guiding that kind of research. But I don't think that just market competition alone will get us there. I mean, people are eating less meat in some, not people are choosing those alternatives, but I don't think it's something where we can kind of expect consumer demand alone to get us out of the mess we're in. I think we need we need policy things, and in that sense I should probably highlight the recent proposal by Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker that was essentially about sort of breaking up big factory farms and phasing them out by 2040. I think addressing those issues of market concentration should be front and center too. So there's a lot of fear. There's so much to be afraid of. And listening to my fellow panelists made me think that, I do believe we need to also articulate the world we want to see, all that could be gained by moving away from a food system that fetishizes animal flesh, that destroys the natural world. I think the world we could have, founded on solidarity across species, is actually one that would be a lot richer and more satisfying than the one we're in, because it's not just, there's something that makes your food, it's not just sort of, the comfort food that we know that gives us satisfaction. I think knowing that the things that we consume and the systems we're dependent on are not based on pain and suffering and ultimately causing our collective demise would be something that would be quite enjoyable. So I think we have to balance that too, of scaring people into action, and then also working on what this alternative world we want to see would be like, and how much we have to gain by not eating meat.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So from what I understand, we're now going to get all the speakers to turn on their video and unmute themselves, if I have that right. And then I've got a few questions that I'd like to start off the conversation with. And I've got a tremendous amount of very good questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. So I think, so I have three main questions to ask of all of you to get this started. And the first one is that it really seems like everyone is zeroing in specifically on intensive animal agriculture, whether we call it factory farming, whether we call it CAFO-based agriculture or whatnot. And often when that gets brought up, there's this sort of chicken and egg question. Who's responsible? Is it a production side push? Is the fault of this the fact that there are these, you know, nefarious corporations who find ways to very efficiently produce animal flesh and then push that on the market? Or is the fault, or yeah, I suppose, is the fault or responsibility with consumers who choose to buy cheap, widely available meat? And I'm not suggesting that either one of these is the correct answer, but it seems like very often in the public discourse, the debate very much becomes fragmented into people who call for individual solutions, go vegan, save the planet, and so on the one hand, or on the other hand, who suggest that individual action is virtually useless, that we need solely systemic action. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on if the primary culprit here is indeed primarily intensive agriculture, and there are a few questions from the audience about smaller scale agriculture we'll get to in a minute, but if the primary culprit is intensive agriculture and the globalization of intensive agriculture, number one, what can individuals do, if anything? Is it even smart to talk about individual responsibility in the face of these large corporate forces? And if not, what specific immediate steps can people take, or can we take, in order to achieve these various goals that you've suggested, be it removing subsidies, be it taxation, be it promotion of more plant-based or alternative protein production? How do we get to even challenging the status quo? Whoever wants to jump in can jump in first, I suppose. Oh, you're muted though, Astra. I think you're gonna have to get unmuted.
I was saying that Mia should maybe do this one. I mean, I feel like, people need to get organized. I guess this is where, we have to build power and create a consensus that these are the demands that we're acting for. So, in my organizing with the Debt Collective, it's that hard work of trying to bring people into an organization and figuring out, who you can pressure at what level. So I think I don't have a more insightful answer than that. Then it's the hard work of organizing. I think somebody mentioned this in the chat, there are some interesting overlaps where these indebted chicken farmers are actually working with activists from Mercy for Animals. And, that is something they've reached out to us about being part of that. And I think unusual cross sections where you have a kind of solidarity you wouldn't expect, or you're expanding your coalition, I think feel really important, especially at this moment when we're seeing how intertwined all of these crises are. But yes, we have to have this expertise, the proposals, the data, and then you have to have that messy people power energy that's really, willing to put their bodies on the line sometimes if that's what's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my first answer, Astra, was organizing, and I really want to acknowledge what you've done in this space. So, Jan, that's a great question. A huge question, and we don't want to take all the time in the webinar to answer that. I would say, I feel like so I think it's both, right? I think people should do what they can in their own lives. Some of us have more agency, more power, more privilege to do those things, right? But I'm a policy person, so I do ultimately think like we need policy change, and that obviously ties with organizing and how do we develop coalitions and how do we hold elected officials, non-elected officials, corporations accountable. But I do think there has been, for many years, even the research, well, people want more meat. Urbanization, population growth, growing wealth, people want more meat. And I actually do think that could be interrogated more. I think there's a real productivist focus, if that's the word, to market meat, to make money. It's often elites in global South countries that are involved in the mechanics of spreading factory farming. Like here, it's powerful individuals, powerful corporations. So, is it really that people want more meat? Yes, there certainly is that. There's cultural associations, there are non-economic factors, but I think the production side also really needs to be challenged. And that is also the power. Now, how exactly do you do that? And there are many different ways to do that. But I do think there's an important role ongoing for documentation in all sorts of different ways. The op-ed you two with your co-author had in The Guardian, science, Matt Hayek and Helen Harwat have a new study out showing how much land and carbon sequestration could be saved by shifting away from animal agriculture. So yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, these questions are always sort of, it's a little annoying when you answer, you don't really answer because there are a number of things. But I do think the consumption aspect of it should be challenged. And I do think there are some interesting coalitions that could develop more. I think sometimes it's the cultural factors that keep some of us separate. I do think in the US, there was the Republican convention, they're coming for your hamburgers. Yet when we look at the economics, and again, I'm not an economist, but I think it's an important piece of it. I mean, most of those, the contract farmers, it's huge exploitation. They're in enormous debt. They're at this kind of margin. I've been told by agricultural economists, a lot of soy producers, they're operating at or below a margin. And I think that isn't as widely documented or known. And sometimes the cultural factors of, you're a vegan from Brooklyn, who are you to come and tell me in Iowa not to do this? Yet some of that is changing a bit at a local level. There are farmers shifting away from some of these monocrops. I think that would be an important thing for public policy to support, absolutely, and coalitions of citizens as well.
For me, I think I see the priority being on bringing the pandemic link, solidifying it in to make policy, we need to, understand the problems first. I think Mia, brought up Livestock's long shadow, the UN report, linking, climate change and other, environmental problems with the livestock industry, talking about the role it plays. And really, I think that helped really solidify and make it more of kind of a mainstream topic of discussion among policy people. But I think we're in that similar state. She was saying how, it used to just be kind of this, speaking Russian, talking about it. I think we're in the same place with pandemics. People are not making the connection between, the primary prevention of pandemics, preventing the emergence of such viruses in the first place. They don't know, that hasn't been the current focus. And I think there's still a lot of ignorance about that. And until that gets out, until that we understand what that's a problem, then only then can we talk about solutions. And there's actually kind of a parallel to the UN's Livestock Long Shadow report that just came out this summer. And I want to share that with people very quickly. So there was this UN report called Preventing the Next Pandemic, which came out recently. Zoonotic diseases and how to break the chains of transmission. If you look down at their themes of emergence, how can we prevent the next pandemic? What are the drivers of zoonotic disease emergence? Driver number one, increasing demand for animal protein. Driver number two is agriculture intensification. All right. So this is a resource that I would encourage people to share. So again, we can bring at least, all agree on the problem and then delve into all the various solutions.
So Dr. Greiner, you mentioned this in your talk, and this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine personally, but it seems like a really big problem in pushing for a plant-forward diet or a less meat-intensive diet is that you run up against the primary factors which influence people's consumption decision, which is price, taste, and habit. And in the face of this, we've seen the emergence, we've seen the growing popularity of plant-based alternative proteins. So the sort of amazing out of nowhere success of Impossible and Beyond. And now we have the promise of cellular agriculture, which is growing animal tissue from stem cells. Astra started pointing to this, but I'd like to ask all of you what role you see these emergent technologies in playing in both reducing our reliance on intensive animal agriculture, perhaps reducing the consumption of animal protein. So what role do they play, I suppose, in an explicitly political strategy to address the goal of mitigating zoonotic risk and reducing intensive animal agriculture? And also, as Astra started pointing to, what problems do you see with this sort of alternative proteins will save the world hype that seems to be increasingly circulating? I don't know, Astra, if maybe you want to start, and we'll do the same run to the panelists as we did the last question.
I mean, I think it's something we should cheer. You know, I think anything that gets people eating less animal flesh, you know, and the reasons that Michael laid out were exactly that. You know, you have cellular tissue, but without the guts and without all of those, you know, attributes of the full animal that are risky. And the fact is that habit is a huge thing for a human being, for all of us, right? And it helps people be weaned off of you know, the food that they're used to eating. So I think it's a good thing. I think it makes the transition to a more vegetarian, a more plant-based diet easier. You know, it's, I think there is something in it that's sort of a promise of change without change. You know, a promise of revolution without the messiness of revolution. Like, we'll just be able to eat this and just substitute things in perfectly. And I guess I'm just a little bit skeptical of that. You know, and I think these issues around who controls these new foods is actually a really important issue. We see Monsanto holding the patents to seeds, and you know what that does to agriculture and to farmers, and you know, so I think in that sense, you know, we should be concerned and support initiatives. New Harvest is one that are trying to ensure that the science will be open from the get-go, so that as it develops, it will benefit the largest number of people on this planet, instead of replicating the dynamics of, you know, the current agribusiness model. You know, but so I'm of dual minds on it, but ultimately, you know, I think what was interesting, we made a joke about this in our op-ed, right, was that what were people eating during lockdown? Beans. You know, bean sales were also going through the roof. And I guess I'm sort of like I just wonder, you know, why can't we eat our legumes, people? But so it goes.
People are still eating beans from what I see, what I read and see. I think my answer would be very similar to Astra, so I don't want to repeat all that, but yeah, I think it's an interesting development. I think it's positive. I worry about the corporate power. I also worry, so on the one hand, sure, if US government would invest in this, Chinese government, you know, South African government, good. I also like the local harvest model, but what I do worry about, and these are tensions and in a fragmentation in a way that Astra mentioned, of lauding Tyson, right, or lauding Cargill when their workers are dying from COVID and they're depopulating animals and they're doing all the same things to animals that they've been doing for 20, 30, 50 years. So, you know, we have to have a number of strategies, but I do worry about that. I worry about being co-opted or putting so much energy into this that the real justice aspects are given less priority. The other thing I would like to see, as someone whose work is really more global and global south, I'd love to see young scientists in South Africa get funding to work on some of these things. Even in China, that could be, you know, both more culturally appropriate, interesting, maybe replicate legumes and other foods in their traditional diet, and not, again, have so much hegemony from the US that we have in like the tech firms that are everywhere around the world and beyond and impossible everywhere around the world. So we have some cautions. We do have actually a long policy paper called Beyond the Impossible, which looks at the science behind this and looks at some of these challenging areas or areas that probably need more reflection and more interrogation. So people would like to find that on the Brighter Green website. It's there.
You know, I love Astra's childhood story. And I think many animal advocates have this sense that if only people knew, right? That if only people saw the glass walls and the slaughterhouses, then everybody would change. And, you know, 30 years ago, all right, that's a legitimate hypothesis. And if only people could see, and then YouTube came around, and if only the young people could see, yes, decade after decade, the percentage of the, for example, US population of vegetarians didn't budge. But okay, the youth, as soon as the youth see the slaughterhouse videos, the meat your meats of the world, everything would change. All right, we have got about a decade to test that hypothesis. And again, very little movement throughout the Western world on the percentage of people who self-identify as vegetarian. There's certainly a small percentage, and we should continue to educate. But I think at this point, since the drivers for most people, for the vast majority of people, are really taste, cost, convenience, that giving people these alternatives, rather than convincing them through a philosophical argument, which works for a small percentage, but if 95% of people are making decisions not based on, you know, philosophy, but based on these kind of, you know, the taste, cost, convenience, then we really do, for the billions on the planet, when we're talking about existential risks, like the threat of a devastating pandemic, a Category 5 pandemic. I mean, when we're talking about risks that big, then the quicker we can reduce the numbers by tens of billions every year, it would seem to me the quickest route would be to provide consumers. And I think the dairy example is, I mean, if, you know, people for decades have been saying, oh, the veal industry, there's cruelty, choose soy milk over dairy milk. And where did it get us? Some people changed, but all of a sudden put these constellation of new consumer choices in the dairy case, and people make the decision, oh, it tastes just as good, it's healthier, and all of a sudden, bankruptcies, major Dean Foods declaring bankruptcy. I mean, and how did that happen? We didn't win the ethical argument. It happened because we gave better consumer choices. And the nonprofit in this area that I'm most excited about is a DC-based organization called the Good Food Institute. In fact, that's where I sent the majority of my the proceeds from my How to Survive a Pandemic book went to the Good Food Institute. And I think they are working on these kind of open source solutions. So it's not, so this technology to create plant-based and cultivated meat is not concentrated in the hands of a few corporations, but is available worldwide.
Can I just follow up on that really quick? I think it's really true. I mean, we also said that with climate change, if only it would come closer to home, people would believe it. Well, here's a fire. So I think sometimes we misunderstand ideology. We think we convince people with arguments, but sometimes the arguments come after the fact, right? Because, you know, I think if we had green jobs available, we'd have a lot more environmentalists. If we had a public program for green jobs or conservation corps, you know, like tree planting, that would make environmentalists after the, by being part of that. And, you know, I see this with my friends. They know meat is, you know, has these health problems, these environmental consequences. And that is part of the attraction to these alternative products. So I think, you know, in our strategies, we have to understand that sometimes it's the opportunity to make a choice, and then the thinking actually comes after that.
So yeah, thank you very much for those. I'm glad you mentioned Dr. Greger, the Good Food Institute. I'd also think I should plug New Harvest, who is doing a lot of, who channels funds to research that aims to be more open access around cellular agriculture. I'm cognizant of our time, and there are so many questions from the audience. So I'm going to start asking those, and I think I'll just sort of throw them out. And if you'd like to answer them, you can answer, but we don't necessarily have to go through all three of you on each question. And I'm going to start lumping these perhaps so we can try to actually get to as many people's questions as possible. So I have sort of a tripartite question about politics put together from three questions from the audience. So the first iteration of this goes like this. I'm in the US where so much has been politicized. How do we take the politics out of this? And here I might add, should we take the politics out of this in light of what you've just said, and bring the conversation to the broader population? For example, when we talk about shifting eating farming practices, the translation for some people is they're eliminating our jobs. Or I also might add, they're going to make me go vegan. So this is a challenge at any other time, but especially now. So how do we overcome this, let's just say, political intransigence or this political problem? Now, a second part of this political question has to do with promoting the ideas that all three of you have been talking about. So this person, in light of this politics question, asks, what about the threat of fake news, false information, and conspiracy theories as they relate to the way NGOs conduct their outreach and education? As a longtime vegan, I've seen a worrying increase in the movement of what I would like to call unfounded, non-evidence-based claims, I suppose pushing for veganism and plant-based eating. So how do we, I suppose, focus on the science and combat these sort of unfounded claims? And the third question about political messaging has to do with how do we have these conversations about pandemic risk, about the nature of agriculture, about the nature of wild animals as vectors of disease transmission, without making it seem as if animals are threats to humans. So without sort of labeling animals as reservoirs of disease, as dirty, disgusting, dangerous, a threat. How do we have these conversations in a way that doesn't cast animals as, I suppose, the culprits in the story of global pandemic? So I'm not sure who'd like to go first and take a stab at all or any of these threads of this question about politics and messaging.
I might try a little bit, Jan, on the last one. Yes, I saw some of that in the chat, and also reference to Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker's work. And I think it's a challenge. I mean, I think all of these things about living in a world where alternative facts is something where truth is contested is really difficult. And I guess I don't have a real answer to that, apart from we have to keep contesting it. But I do think with the animals as dirty, the animals as source, I mean, to me, that is part of a narrative and part of the science that it is humans who are making incursions into animals' habitat. It is humans who are exploiting animals. It's not the animals coming, right, and saying, I want to be on a factory farm or something along those lines. And I think that has to be reiterated over and over. So I think it is a messaging issue. It's a science issue. It's we certainly wouldn't want COVID to lead to like a backlash against non-human animals, and maybe in some places it has. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think that probably has many, many layers to it, but I do think to reiterate the fact, the science, Michael showed us the report from UNEP, how do you prevent another pandemic? It's not, keep animals out. On the other hand, there probably should be more boundaries between humans and animals, in terms of where we do go into their habitats. And then just the other quick point on, the vegan and the conspiracy theory. I've heard about that too. I mean, that's a problem because there can be so much proliferation, right? And how many people are going to engage in that and try to state the facts again. So that's probably an ongoing challenge, but I think an unfortunate development.
On the culprits question, I mean, I think it's important to recognize, for example, influenza. The influenza virus has existed for millions of years as this, natural waterborne infection of waterfowl before anyone ever got the flu. Only with the domestication of waterfowl did influenza even infect people. And then we've had, domesticated waterfowl for over 4,000 years and still never saw this unprecedented emergence of highly pathogenic, highly disease-causing strains until the late 70s, when we started seeing this kind of Tysonization, this export of this factory farm model around much of the world. In terms of the science question, that's near and dear to my heart. I run a website called nutritionfacts.org, which very much tries to, make this evidence-based arguments about plant-based eating on all fronts. And a quick note on the politics, if one looks at smoking cessation, which is really one of public health's greatest victories, that started with public policies. The first institutions to ban smoking were these federal properties, where on federal grounds, these were the first smoking bans. And we can see, and one could imagine similar types of policy in terms of, purchasing power of prisons and the military and schools and all other kind of federal purchasing power. That is kind of within public policy's arena to affect, default choices. So, for example, in New York City, they eliminated processed meat from millions of school meals in all the public schools, thanks to Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, who's running for mayor of New York City. And so, I mean, those kind of decisions with one stroke of the pen, all of a sudden millions of meals change, would seem is a lever that I think we have not yet flexed to full capacity in this arena. And obviously, we may require a change in political leadership before we can fully flex that. But there's certainly things we can still do.
Yeah, I mean, to quickly build on what people have said, I think, that is a really powerful example. We also have to remember that what's in the school lunches is not just neutral and they're spontaneously, right? So it's already always political. And who has access to government contracts and subsidies is we're countering that politicization. I mean, I think it's tough. I mean, I think on the one hand, this idea of giving people other choices, and not making it a political issue has a lot of validity. I think for me, I'm in dialogue with people who are fighting for economic justice, who are political people, who see themselves as progressive or anti-capitalist, social democrats, democratic socialists. And I want to say, if you want to live your political values, then you have to take these issues seriously, right? And so in that sense, I think we can go into political communities and address this as a political issue. On the fake news front, I guess, again, the quote from our piece that says, eating meat is a socially acceptable form of science denial. A lot of people who believe science, still don't want to face these facts. In fact, Jan wrote something for the New Republic about the response from environmentalists to a UN tweet that suggested eating less meat. A lot of esteemed people were upset about that. It's not just this distant threat of people who believe fake news. We have to also engage people closer to us. As far as fake news on, especially on the internet, to me, I'm like, this is something where, I have a whole other life as a technology writer. The YouTube algorithm has to go. This autoplay, I mean, it's a tech policy problem in some ways, and there's a reason they don't want to let go of that. They get that really increases their clicks. So, but a one-line policy would help democracy.
Absolutely.
So there are a few other political questions about politics here that I'd like to ask now, because I think they fit well. So we tend to, or not we here among us, the panelists and myself and Kathrin, but there tends to be a notion that food policy and especially issues around animals are this separate thing. It exists in the realm of individual choice or this realm of agriculture. What discursive strategies or what real political strategies or what policy levers are there to start really bringing food and animal issues into the mainstream? So I'm thinking here in terms of how do you, for instance, help farmers transition to not producing or not being contracted to large-scale producers? How can you make credible, real pitches for a just transition for jobs for people who would theoretically lose jobs, be it in slaughterhouses or in farming, as we transition away from, if we were to transition away from an industrial agriculture animal model? Moreover, how do we speak to environmentalists? How, for instance, do we talk to the folks who are into, be it a carbon tax or a Green New Deal? How do we get them on board with doing away with intensive animal production or get them on board with alternative proteins? So I suppose what options do you all see for making these strategic links? And then there's a question here specifically for Astra among the questions, which is, could we mobilize the deep pockets of philanthropic donors to set up a fund to retire the debt of or refinance animal farmers in exchange for those farmers converting their operations to producing plant-based foods for humans? Mercy for Animals has created this sort of project. And do you see, I suppose, alignment with some kind of debt forgiveness or economic freedom for farmers being incorporated to allow this transition in a just way without just bankrupting farmers or saying that they don't matter in this broader story of transition away from intensive animal agriculture?
Mm-hmm. Does someone want to kick off the bigger questions first? I feel like I'm the least qualified on those issues.
How about that? Yeah, again, great questions, really big issues. So I think in terms of food policy and animal agriculture, meat being very separate, I think that's changing a bit. And I would say, I think that is changing a bit because of the science. I think it's changing a bit because of people's own life experiences. I think that's sometimes changing because they have kids and teenagers who know more about these issues, are more interested in environment and animals and issues around justice and power, climate change for sure. I mean, a number of the young climate activists, from Greta Thunberg to Vanessa Nakate to others in the US, they are aware of the role of food systems and agriculture in climate change and do talk about that from time to time. And I think what interests them is the science is evolving and getting stronger, or the case is being made in many different ways. But I think also the power issues, right? These are industries that have huge power, not exactly analogous to fossil fuels, but not that dissimilar. There are some initiatives. There's something called the Good Food Purchasing Program, which a number of cities in the US have adopted. So it's not a vegan initiative, but it does have tenets about animal welfare, about sustainability, about workers, treatment, about equity. That's under discussion to be adopted by New York City. And there have been some commitments at the city council. I think it's been set back because of COVID. So I actually think even in a global context around biodiversity, around climate change, I see less of that, let's say, boundaried set of issues. And again, I sound like I'm repeating these climate activists, which I'm happy to do, but I do think the science is quite strong. And I think that the economic case against this system is quite strong as well. And given, again, what we've talked about, these externalities for the environment, for public health, are enormous and growing. And we haven't talked a lot about that, but things like chronic diseases that are caused by diet, caused by poor food intake, and that's obviously very much tied to power and wealth. And we've seen that as a risk factor in the COVID crisis. You know, people with diabetes, people with obesity. So it just ramifies the wrongness of the system. And yet I realize when we talk that way, it's like, it's so huge. What do you do tomorrow? But I do think things like Good Food Purchasing Program, school food, and I think those of us involved in systems or policy processes around climate, around animals, more broadly around biodiversity, I think that there's more of an openness to this kind of discussion. If I can leave it there, Jan. I mean, it would be good to be more concrete, but some of these things are really emerging and kind of changing quite quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, quickly on that initiative with chicken farmers collaborating with Mercy for Animals, I don't know that much about it. I'm not part of it, but if people have reached out to me. And part of the idea is that there are many chicken farmers who would rather not be chicken farmers, right? They would happily switch to something plant-based, to be hemp farmers, for example, if they could, except they are in these massive, they're under this incredible debt load to the processor. And so the idea is to help, I believe the idea is to help them get the resources to then free themselves and transition to another form of farming. The debt collective organizer in me says, don't pay those odious, immoral debt contracts. What farmers need to do is come together and refuse to pay to go on a debt strike. This is a tactic that we've had a lot of success with in the student debt space. We've launched 2 student debt strikes and won over $1 billion of student debt relief. And in fact, yesterday, Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer made a Senate resolution based on our legal arguments for full-scale debt cancellation. So I think you can accomplish a lot more. Those philanthropic dollars can go further if you engage in a strategic battle with capital instead of just buying your way out. So I'd like to see that kind of political engagement. And what a piece of public education, right? Because to have those allies, to have farmers say, this isn't working for us, stop using us as your props, is a powerful, powerful political statement. And that's why I think these, again, unusual solidarities are important.
I had a question for Mia. In 2016, the Chinese government released dietary guidelines encouraging the Chinese populace to cut meat consumption by 50%. And it was, at the time, climate activists were cheering. And I was just wondering, what's happened since in the last 5 years or so? Did they actually go through with it? Did they put programs into place to actually facilitate this? Are they putting the money where their mouth is? It seemed like such an exciting, movement at the time. I'm just wondering if you have any kind of sense, an update for us on whether that's actually translated into decreasing consumption or policy.
Yeah, I can answer that, and I'll try to be quick about that. Unfortunately, it's not really good news. I mean, that whole dietary guidelines got a lot of attention in the West, and The Guardian and others. Many activists were very excited about it. And in China, it's hard to find anyone who's really even heard of it. So I think the short version is it really wasn't a mandate. It was a quasi-diet guidelines by a quasi-governmental agency. It wasn't as if the whole Chinese government was saying that. And there doesn't seem to have been any real implementation strategy behind it or public education. That doesn't mean people in China can't refer to it, but it's not as if the mass mobilization the Chinese government could do was mobilized in any obvious way to support that. That being said, they're working on another diet guideline, and it's possible. There's more of this concept of sustainability. But yeah, short answer is, unfortunately, a lot of people made a lot of hay about that, and it didn't have a grounding. And it also did call for increases in dairy. One person asked him the question, why are you talking about dairy? And I would say meat is sort of shorthand for dairy and eggs as well. Maybe we shouldn't use it that way. Call for increases in dairy, increases in seafood and consumption. And I mean, there's huge challenges in the oceans around providing seafood or producing that much seafood. So, but it doesn't mean things can't change. Like there is more awareness in China. There are climate vegans in China. There are policymakers with growing interest in this space. But yeah, nothing concrete.
All right, so I think we have time for, I understand Michael is on a schedule, so we have time for one more question, which I think is an important one for the people listening, which is, for a young person that is passionate about shifting our agricultural system to a plant-based one, but also obviously has to pay rent. What organizations and jobs do you recommend, or what opportunities are there for people to actually develop careers in this field? So how can people who care actually work in what they're passionate about?
Can I begin? Because I think I'll have the least insightful thing here, which is, I would say it doesn't have to be as literal as working on animal issues full time, right? Because we need to spread these ideas into other areas. So whether your domain is, the medical profession, or whether you are a lawyer, or whether you are a teacher, or whether, you're someone like me who's working and trying to spread ideas and build the debt resistance, right? These ideas actually need to travel widely. And so I think that, I think there's, human beings eat every day. That's part of why this is such a tough issue, the intimacy of that, right? The everyday nature of it. And so, I think that's this, what's been striking to me is since my childhood, I've managed to kind of quarantine myself from some of these conversations for decades, because they don't travel as far as they need to. So I guess that would be my advice, to take the issues wherever it is that you land, whatever communities you're involved in.
No, I think that's good advice. I would agree with that. And I think, again, I do see more of these coalitions, and I don't know exactly where the questioner is, if they live in the US, if they live somewhere internationally, around food justice, around farm transformation, around organizing around climate, where you could bring these issues around animal agriculture and food justice and climate justice together. So I think there are probably a number of spaces. If someone wants to be in touch with me, that's fine. I can put my email, or it's on the Brighter Green website. There's a thing called the HEAL Food Alliance. It's set up in the US. It's specifically a BIPOC organization, so leadership building through Black and Brown people and immigrants as well. And they are really working across a number of issues, labor, environment, sustainability in the food space. And we're part of the effort I mentioned, calling out Tyson and other meat producers for the COVID infections in the summer. And I've been really impressed with their vision. And again, you might not find all vegans there, but you won't find an allergy to discussing these issues, right? As they affect workers, as they affect the environment, and as they affect animals. So I think that, I think there are a number of organizations out there. But actually, Jan, it does remind me that we've had a number of interns come through Brighter Green and fellows over the years, and I do think the paid, like a career job in this space, is lagging the demand for that. And again, that could change, both the way philanthropic funding is channeled, the way organizations see their work. So I think there is that unfortunate gap. But I do think there are more opportunities.
I have a wonderful resource for people, something I wish existed when I was growing up. There's a nonprofit called 80,000 Hours. And so if you go to 80,000hours.org, so 80,000 hours is about the time the average person spends in a career. And the question is, how are you going to spend those 80,000 hours? This arose out of the effective altruism movement. Like, how can we make our donor dollars be most impactful? Well, 80,000 hours took this and says, okay, how can I make my time on this earth most impactful? It's like an evidence-based activist career counseling organization. Amazing. They have some wonderful resources. So I encourage people to check it out. And in terms of guiding one's, one of the most important decisions we have to make in our life, how are we going to contribute our time and energy? So I would definitely recommend 80,000hours.org.
Fantastic. Well, being aware of Michael's schedule and the fact that we're almost at 2 hours, I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. I'm sure that, speaking at least for myself and what Mia said, I'm sure you can get in touch with the individual speakers if you have particular questions or are looking for advice. And I'm sure that the individual speakers would also, as a number of people have asked, be willing to send you their sources, or perhaps we could get Kathrin to post the sources that were referenced by the speakers somewhere so that people have access to this sort of bibliography that we talked about. I would like to thank all our speakers so much for your time and insights and generous, detailed answers to the questions that were asked. And I'd like to thank all of you for letting me moderate this. And I think Kathrin just had a few words about the series of talks that this is the first part of. And so, Kat, it's all yours. And thank you all again very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really, really inspiring and interesting and wonderful. And we are going to gather the resources, and I will send a follow-up email to everybody. And I just wanted to, thanks a lot again to all our speakers. And I wanted to make you aware that our second webinar will take place on October 16th at noon EST again. And we will actually talk about COVID-19 research with or without animals. We will use the COVID-19 pandemic as an example to discuss why using research methods and tools that are based on human biology is crucial in finding effective and safe treatments and cures for human illnesses. So I hope you will sign up and tune in again. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend and rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for the great questions. Thanks for
Bye. Thank you.